Side chat here. My name is Scott Fitzsimons, looking after all the whiskey and spirits here at the bottle store, and I'm very excited to welcome Jordan Felix from the Westward Distillery into the belly of the oak barrel, right deep in the tasting room here, to have a little bit of a chat about this American single malt whiskey, which straight off the bat is not a typical thing that we've seen in right. whiskey generally. We've had it in here in the oak barrel for about a year now, particularly in its current form. But one of the things that I've loved about Westward and the American craft distilling industry is it mirrors the Australian one very well. So the concepts and the ideas are very, very easily digestible. And I think that also means that the whiskey is very much to the Australian palate as well. But Jordan, welcome to Australia. You're an Australian originally.
Yes. Yeah, Australian originally, but my accent somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. I've lived in the US around 10, 11 years now, and Portland, Oregon is home. I live about 3 blocks from the distillery, so it keeps me honest. So not honest either way. With the booze.
We're pretty lo-fi and casual here at the Oak Barrel, but yes, this is the accent. That's not the microphone going in and out. It's not. I'm not hitting an American mode or anything. It's coming through. So I mean, first and foremost, what gets you to Portland?
So for me, I started. I got my chops basically here in Melbourne when I started managing a bar called New Gold Mountain, and it was attached to Double Happiness and Lily Black's down there. I came from the bar trade. I'd been in hospitality since I was 16. Then I moved to New York and worked with Danny Meyer and sort of opened up these barbecue joint, and then finally moved over to Portland and worked with Jeffrey Morgenthaler at Clyde Common, opened a whiskey library, which was about 1,800 different whiskeys, another 600 other spirits, and we had bar carts and we did this sort of tailoring. So I'd spent some time with whiskey, and over that time building the whiskey library and getting to know all these brands, I became like a Kentucky Colonel and all the stuff that I had done for the Kentucky. But I really believed in, and I still believe in, that Portland and the Northwest can produce incredible whiskey. And this opportunity of Westward came along 3 years ago. And I haven't looked back since. And it's been really awesome. I'm also one of the blenders for Westward American Single Malt. Miles Monroe, who's the lead distiller, Christian Croxad, the founder, and then Andrew Tice, the director of operations. So heavy hand in everything that I do. So I love speaking to a whiskey that I know very intimately and work out of the distillery.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things, we had Miles through to run a tasting with us, and a few people might have been there earlier in the year. And I think one of the things, and Westward whiskey has been around in a few different guises, and house spirits do a lot of different products. And some people might be familiar with the half bottles and the white label that were around previously. But I think when we take this, the new black label Westward, the one that's in all the stores and in all the bars, when we sort of introduce this, I think it's important to say that this comes from a brewing culture.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, I'm a firm believer that all beer is undistilled whiskey.
Yes, that's right.
It is brewing is an integral part of distilling that isn't always spoken about, particularly in the older world for whiskies. So, I mean, like, we all know that America's got a huge craft brewing culture. Yes. How does that work in terms of when we're talking about whiskey?
As in terms of working with whiskey, I mean, like as we talked about, just to touch on, with the traditional style, they talk a lot about still shapes, maybe a special type of barley, a particular finish, how you blend it and that sort of stuff. And there's a big chunk of that whiskey production that's just not talked about. And that's really where we set ourselves aside. And we all come from craft breweries throughout Portland. Portland now has 70 breweries, over 5-barrel systems. There's another 30 that's one barrel. We're only behind Denver as in terms of breweries per capita. So super steeped history in Oregon about brewing. But we say like whiskey comes from beer, but it goes more than that for us, because what we do is we make beer first, and then we make whiskey. And it's like we make a really great unhopped pale ale, and from that then we distill. And really our distillation technique is what we've coined as minimalist distilling, because we're wanting to essentially take all the essence that we've created there, and we've been so delightfully inefficient with everything we've done. It's a really inefficient way of creating a whiskey. Our malt is a brewer's malt. It's not a distiller's malt. So right there, you're already talking about flavor, not yield. And there's nothing wrong with yield. We have to make whiskey. So and then we get into the brewery side, and already the yeast, we're choosing an ale yeast versus a distiller's yeast, and we're wanting to go for those complex sugars, those tannins and those esters, really create right there in fermentation.
Yeah, and it's great because we're doing a one-on-one chat. I don't have any other oak barrel staff around.
Yeah.
So I can say to all the brewers out there that you can still see the lights and go the next proper step. And go
yes, that's right. Make the next step.
Distill spirit.
Yeah.
So that's sort of where we're coming from.
Yeah.
When you are blending, essentially what is a core range.
Yes.
And there's, they're quite small batches and, single barrel sometimes.
Yeah.
What are you looking for in consistency, particularly when we're talking about an American single malt rather than something that carries a straight bourbon or a straight rye or that sort of label? How do you introduce people to an American single malt whiskey?
Yeah, I mean, I truly believe that it's the liquid shows up for itself. It's often just a case of you need to try this without the preconceived notions that really happen. That really, let me pour some of them. Yeah, we should probably have
speaking words.
But
beauty, thanks, mate.
Yeah, of course. We have so many preconceived notions about what whiskey is, and straight away, if we mention for 1 second we have barrels like bourbon, people's heads go to bourbon, right? Or we go 100% barley and they go to what they think of single malt. So we've actually had a lot of success of just simply pouring it and going, try it, and really the proof is in the pudding. It's really what people love about it, and what we see also in blending is we look at these 5 major characteristics. We look definitely fruit straight away. That longer fermentation is going to allow for a lot of really wonderful fruit flavors that come through. A lot of melon, pineapple, some tropical like papaya, that sort of stuff coming in. It's tight, a little tight citrus notes as well.
Yep.
And then Westward has an inherent sweetness. And that really does come from a brewer's malt. So we have fruit and sweetness, and then we go to like a herbal quality. And I think it's kind of interesting. It's coincident that the American single malts that are doing really well also have legalized marijuana in the US. So, the herbal element might be some other influence there. But then we also look at some really great some baking spices that show up. That's predominantly coming from that new American oak, that medium char oak, and then also an earthy element. And that earthy element really pulls from both. It's actually from fermentation and maturation. Sometimes you get a little bit of wood smoke coming in there as well. From fermentation side, you got some of those earthy, like damp tobacco sort of really interesting notes in the back palate. Yeah.
So this is exclusively new virgin oak?
Yes, exclusively full size, 53 gallons. And that was one thing that really, for me, when coming on 3 years ago, I asked, have we experimented in anything smaller? What should I be preparing myself for? Have we cut any corners? No. Westward has always been full size, 53 gallons. And I think that speaks to the fact that they've taken such a long time with the barley and brewing and getting that right first before going to the distillation and maturation. Yeah. And to cut a corner right towards the end might not be the most optimal thing. Yeah.
And it's really interesting because I think, different drinking cultures and different, countries, particularly if, there's so many different variations of whiskey in the world, will pick out different things. And for me, just as when I first tried this, as trying it again today, it was the oak that stood out for me first, because I've been drinking so much whiskey that's been matured in refill oak of various stages. But yes, very much that drier spice at the end. So that I got definitely the pineapple is what I always pick out on this. And then that sort of like quite creamy lengthy finish to it. I guess another reason, one question I wanted to ask is because of the brewing background you're using malt, is that why I go for a single malt rather than try and do a bourbon? Or
I definitely with that, and also the fact that we're really we're a whiskey of Northwest provenance, so we really our ethos and the way that we've come from is like we want to pull from our strengths, and the Pacific Northwest and the Northwest Portland. For those who don't know, we've already alluded to the steeped brewing heritage, but barley grows naturally up there. It's this beautiful climate for it. Comparable to Scotland in a lot of ways, a lot of rainfall on the coast, and then through the mainland, it's long hours of sunlight, but not hot. So it's like cool, long hours of sunlight. And then in the summer, we have these short, hot summers. And so what that allows for is those long hours of sunlight is just optimal for barley. Barley's used particularly in the Northwest and other parts of the United States as a cover crop. So it's it helps prevent soil erosion. So it works incredibly well with vines. So it makes sense that, wine and that sort of stuff is growing up in that area too. Yeah.
We're starting to see in Australia, and I think one of the biggest issues for growth of American whiskey in Australia is sheer access. Yeah. America's a big place. You don't need to sell it to Australia if you can sell it all on the mainland. But there's more and more sort of single malts coming through. Are you seeing that as well? It's been a really interesting tour. This is actually one of my last meetings before I head back to the US. We've been to Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, and Melbourne. And what's been really interesting to see the other American single malts out there. Westland as just out there with their couple of core expressions. Colkegan in just a very small amount from Santa Fe, New Mexico, experimenting with mesquite, which is a really interesting sort of take on things as well. Which we've had through the oak barrel in previous times as well.
Yeah, and it's McCarthy's. The one fun thing about McCarthy's is back in 1996, Steve McCarthy, at that time Scottish of descent, started the Clear Creek Distillery out in Oregon, wanted to create a single malt and he liked the peated stuff. So he was, he wanted to go and get some peated barley. And in 96, he had the audacity to say American single malt on the label. And so actually McCarthy's, if you see it out there, is the first brand that had the audacity to put American single malt on the label, and it always has done. And also to do it in Gariana barrels as well, which is really fascinating too, because Westland's made such a big deal with the Garianas. Steve McCarthy's done that since 96, and different barrels, but still Gariana nevertheless. So there's a little bit of McCarthy's out there. Sadly, there's not enough capital to really push that as much anymore. But so the big players you'll see is Westland, us, Westward, and then and sporadically you'll see Colkegan. Balcones, I've seen a couple of Balcones, but Balcones mainly focuses on their bourbon and rye.
And I think that's very much the point. We've seen some other ones. I think Kings County did Sangamon as well that we've sort of come through. There's little bits and pieces. Do you find that it's ever a hindrance being an American single malt as opposed to being a Scotch or a Australian or a Japanese and not a bourbon or rye? Like, is there any consumer or industry pushback from that sometimes, just on paper when they see it?
So I think that's a great question. So I feel like you kind of have this old world, new world, right? So the old world, you have the single malt, you have Scotland, it's got their traditional techniques and everything, and then you could also argue bourbons is an old world as well, right? Because it's steeped in tradition and Kentucky and all that jazz as well. It's one of the first, and also now the native, has been the native spirit of the United States since 1964. So you could argue that it's also old world. So there's a little bit of a confusion where they don't consider necessarily the United States to be a new world, but I would argue no, because it's like there's so much versatility to the land and where they're going, and where everyone is going in the United States. I mean, back when we started in 2002, there were like 61 distilleries, and now there's 2,087 after the last census, which was pretty amazing to see in the 20 years that sort of have grown over this time. And I really do think that we have a new world mentality, which is really fun to share with. And that's, I mean, as in terms of hindrance, it takes a moment for some people to sort of go, oh, cool, there's more things that the United States produce other than bourbon.
Now, something you touched on there, I've always sort of considered, we're making, a few general statements here, but when we talk about like Scotch whiskey, and you do talk about terroir, where the distillery, is it on island, where they're getting their peat from, all that sort of thing. when bourbon's made that big comeback in the last past 2 decades, it's almost been like a cultural terroir rather than an environmental one. Where and you talk about all the big American whiskey houses, it's all a name, and the son or the daughter is sort of taking on. And we make 7 types of whiskey in this one space, but it's all the cultural thing coming back, and that's been that. But I think with Westward, it's sort of a little bit of both, because you're starting to talk about grain again. Just sort of sit in the middle of those two. Not necessarily like styles of whiskey, but even like the mindset when you approach these whiskies. And, we're right at the start, really, of Westward's journey.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's going to be fascinating.
It's fascinating to sort of see, we're 20 years in the game. We did clear spirits all the way up into 2015 with aviation and selling that brand. And we still produce it, but we have nothing to do with it anymore. We grew up the long way. There's a lot of other people who go and buy juice and bring it in and make their own, and that's completely fine. That's another step, step of being able to create whiskey. But it's the start of the journey. I mean, the American Single Malt, Westward American Single Malt, we launched this in July 2017 into the US market, and it's more like. As in terms of the single barrels that came before, they were so individualistic. We saw so much variation with a brewing because we weren't big enough yet. So we had the breweries handling our wash and that sort of stuff. But once we started to use the juice that we were making all ourselves, we started to see this cohesive taste profile coming through, and it's really offered something new and bold, different than anything else that's on the market. Yeah.
Which again is quite interesting, because you do see a lot of new brands come on, and there's special releases every day and these sort of things. And I see it from a retail point of view. Like we're the 1% of a retail store where we will talk about whatever. Right. But if you don't have someone explaining it to you, that can be quite confusing for a consumer. Absolutely. At a bar, I know that label. Hold on, that doesn't taste anything like what I did, what I tried last week, and so that can be a bit of a hindrance. But you guys are doing some weirder and some special stuff as well. It's a bit of experimenting.
Absolutely. And I mean, I like to say that Portland is a hotbed of invention, and there's a lot of people working in between the different communities together, particularly the brewing community. Makes sense. Also, our malting facility, Great Western Malting, is the first malting facility that opened after Prohibition in 1934. Family owned for a long time, but has an overarch thing with Grain Corp, which also has these Aussie and these South African ties as well. What's really cool about them, and they have a malt innovation center, which is really fun. Terry Farendorf, which for those over here in Australia might not be as relevant. She's an incredibly prominent female brewer, and she started this society, if you will, called the Pink Boots Society. It's like big pink gum boots, and it was essentially she just started this registry of all the different female brewers so that they could essentially get a lot of information and share that information back and forth on the internet. And this was back very early days, like 2003-4 of this sort of thing. And Terry has always been ahead of the curve and that sort of stuff. And so we've actually worked with her over the last couple of years, and we just did a collaboration with Stormbreaker Brewery in Portland with a biscuit rye, which was really cool. And she's constantly looking at these different sort of grain varietals and what we can produce here in the Northwest. And we're obviously always up for collaboration and invention. So yeah. I mean, it's fascinating, and this is certainly not a complaint in any way, but I think every 3 months we have someone from Westward in Australia. We've had distillers and CEOs and brand ambassadors. But what that sort of tells to me is that Australia is a very important market for the brand. Absolutely. Which is quite interesting, because we're not normally first off. You play your homeland, and you play somewhere else. Yeah, we're not normally first off the rank on that. Why why Australia? Australia, we see the really the deep knowledge and understanding of the craft brewery, and I really, you understand beer. You feel the passion for the brewing down here as well. You also feel you understand single malt better. Or I say I'm also Australian as well. So it's going back and forth. So am I here? Am I there? But also the appreciation of single malt, and bourbon is not so much of a hurdle. Do you know what I mean? So like in the US, it's constantly the questions from the consumers are, why won't you create a bourbon? And considering, bourbon's the national spirit and all that sort of stuff. Well, we're trying to show you that the United States has an incredible topography and showcases so many different environments that you can produce some really amazing grain to glass whiskies that don't have to adhere to a traditional standpoint. And I think there's something about Australia also that really appreciates things that are new and different as well. And I think it sort of, ties up the appreciation of single malt, the appreciation of brewing, and also the appreciation of something new and different that sort of breaks through, and something that someone hasn't had. It's bold and it's robust. It's very Aussie.
Yeah.
It's
really funny because I've had almost the exact same conversations, but from the other side.
People go,
right. The Americans get what we're trying to do.
Right.
Are you seeing much Australian, maybe not whiskey yet, but like spirits in general coming through?
Yeah, Four Pillars has actually had a really great start into Los Angeles and also on the East Coast. I would say LA though is littered through Four Pillars. We even saw the Bloody Shiraz gin come up, which is really fascinating to see, and that's sort of getting people's mind to think about different gins as well through there. Whiskey wise, Sullivan's Cove, after it got that medal, of course, people started to buy.
Probably got more of it than I can get.
Yeah, that's probably it. Starward has also made its debut in the United States, doing very well in New York, and then is obviously spreading throughout the US as well. And it's a different appreciation, I think, you start to see from the spirit side. Aussie beer, I will say what's really interesting is the Aussie beer on that side is not making as much of an impact as the spirits. So it's kind of interesting. I still have to deal with when people try to meld through my accent and go, "Oh, you're Australian." They're like, "Oh, I love Foster's," and I still have to be like, "Yeah, mate, no." Yeah. And nothing, look, we're talking about big generalizations today, but just for me personally, that's not my beer of choice, but there you go.
Yeah. I think, we also see that as well. We're getting a little bit off topic, but the beer, we sell a lot of beer here at the Oak Barrel, and 5 years ago, we had a much bigger American contingent. Because some of the Australian quality was still getting up in terms of consistency.
Yeah.
But beer doesn't travel perfectly every time.
Yeah.
And so it becomes expensive when you have to cold freight things. And I think that's probably the way.
Yeah.
It's just another reason why all beer should be distilled, because whiskey travels perfectly.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah. I love that you see it as undistilled. That's great. I love it.
Yeah, so we had a few people with wines here the other week, and I had to bring out some brandy because that's what you're meant to do with grapes.
That was supposed to do with grapes.
Now you've got a red label something here.
Yes.
This is not in the Australian market.
Not yet. So I will specialize or make an emphasis on yet, because it is coming 2020. We're looking at an April-May release. Just as you head into winter. But this is the Westward American Single Malt Oregon Stout Cask Finish, and it makes sense considering we're coming from brewing to come over, our first release be something to do with beer and something that we make well. So, as I talked about, Portland is such a collaborative market. So when we, one of the first questions that people ask about Westward American Single Malt, it's full size new American oak. Where do those barrels go afterwards? Because we're not filling with Westward again. So those barrels actually go back to our breweries.
Yep.
That we've all come from. We've either not necessarily poached staff from, but staff has come over, and all of our distillers are previous brewers.
And the old Hessian sack job.
Hessian sack, yeah, that's right, exactly. And we send these barrels out to about 30 breweries, actually. And so what they do is then they age their stouts and porters in. Some really great breweries, Fort George out there on the coast, Breakside, which you've seen some down here. In fact, we've had a really great, we're building a really wonderful relationship with Deschutes. We sent off 80 barrels the other week to Deschutes to fill with stout, and for a lot of those specialized projects, so like the Abyss and the Dissident and many other ones. So you'll start to see in 2020 and 2021 some of those come out with Westward barrels, which is really, really great. Yeah, cool. So they're taking on that. But yes, so they'll age their stouts and porters, and then we'll get the barrels back. They'll be stout seasoned, if you will. Yeah. And then we fill the Westward American Single Malt, so an average of around 3.5 to 4 years already, and put it in those stout season casks for a minimum of a year, if not more.
Yeah.
So, and then we tend to look for more of an oatmeal and imperial stout versus say those cloying sweet milk and chocolate stouts.
Yeah. And someone was actually just going to comment on there, but you beat me to the punch, which is great in terms of like the length of the finishing, and that's almost a double maturation more than a finish. I don't really like talking about age when it comes to whiskey. If it's too young, you need to talk about it. If it's too old, you need to talk about it. If it's at the right spot, then you shouldn't really be talking about it, whatever. You are not bound by age.
No, we're not. And honestly, when we went to go and release Westward American Single Malt, we started to think about that quite a bit. And considering the SWA, the Scotch Whisky Association, established the minimum of 3 years, kind of like insisting, and whilst obviously not a international rule at all, that was kind of where the things started. We had an old enough stock. This was always going to be a minimum of 3 anyway when we had it ready to go.
Right.
So we were already ahead of the game, for a lot of those American single malt distilleries that are up and coming. We've seen plenty of, and like you said, I love that you said that, is like the age is just a number. And we've seen some amazing whiskey show up at 1.5 years and 2 and that sort of stuff. And we've worked with that into, just trying to understand what's going on with our wood. Because remember, it's very new still, as in terms of the topography and the provenance and the terroir in there and in the climate of just how it interacts with wood in that it's really Westland. There's another American single malt distillery called Copperworks up in Seattle as well, and then us, and that's pretty much it. There's a couple of small distilleries, but no one's taking the attention and time to really see how this environment works with our wood. And work with the wood that we put it in.
Because 3 years in Scotland minimum. It's 2 years here in Australia. There's no.
Sorry to come back to it. There's no minimum. Right.
And it's I'm not opposed to that. Obviously, these laws are in there for quality control, and you don't want people passing off old whiskey at six weeks old, that sort of thing.
Right.
But I think something we're hopefully starting to talk about in Australia is not so much years but summers.
Right.
Where at the end of October now, it's going to get really hot really, really quickly.
Yes.
You're laying down a barrel today.
Yep.
18 months, you're going to be looking pretty good.
Yeah.
Whereas if you wait 6 months, you're probably going to need the 2 years.
Yeah.
So I actually really like that sort of model.
Yeah.
Particularly for a craft industry that's sort of built to its environment.
Yeah.
But on this whiskey, the first, my immediate impression from this was that it's more familiar than what the Westwood is.
Yes.
The standard one is, just because there is that bit of oak there.
Yes.
It's not necessarily, stout casks aren't very common or popular, but there was something there that was really interesting. Whereas I think the virgin oak, just that beautiful sweet spice from Quercus alba, sort of grabs you. So I actually think this is going to be quite a popular whiskey down here in Australia.
Yeah, and I think what we've seen from the feedback that we've had on this particular trip, and then also when Miles's trip as well on the stout cask, is it does round out the core a little bit more. Like as you talked about, like a little extra of that wood is really coming through nicely, and the oatmeal is really prominent. Like some of the complexity on the grain is really showing up as well, which is fascinating. And we've always been a very viscous spirit, and this just adds that to it, which is really great. But it definitely rounds out the core. And I've started to see in the US now that we actually have the Oregon Stout Cask in three states, Oregon, California, and New York, and they're doing really well. So what we've started to see is a division of consumers, just a small amount. We have people that are just enjoying the core, which is fantastic. And they've had the stout and they really enjoyed it, but they were like, this is really great to sort of sit and because it's so new and different. So it's almost like the second one is now allowing for a deeper appreciation of the core, which is really cool to see. And we didn't really expect that to happen, you know? Yeah.
Well, it's the same when you're trying a whiskey for the first time. You nose, you swallow, and then you go back and nose because your olfactory glands have kicked into gear.
Right.
It's on a bigger scale
than
that. And I just want to make one comment as well. Why I think this is so great is we're talking about the brewing culture that this whiskey has come from. There would always be that, almost that that want or that temptation to go and throw it in a wine cask, whether it be a fortified sherry or port or a thing, because that's what other people do.
Right.
But I'm a firm believer that you make whiskey and spirits to your environment.
Yes.
You try and make something else out of that world, you're going to have a bad time.
Absolutely.
So I think that works really, really well. And I think probably, very, very smart on your team's behalf to do that. But I know you've got a plane to catch soon, so I'll ask one more question.
Yeah.
When we're sitting here in a year's time, talking rubbish and drinking whiskey, what are we going to be talking about as the future of Westward?
For Westward, that's a great question. I think it's funny, it kind of touches on your last point, because there is another element to Oregon that, we all know, but we don't, there's not a lot of tapping into it, is the Pinot. Is the Pinot Noir, but it's not just Pinot. Now Oregon Chardonnay is it's winning some awards. It's really cool. The terroir and everything, that the environment has changed dramatically with global warming and climate change. And it's a really interesting. The seasons are getting a little longer. The harvests are taking a little longer, and it's fascinating to see. Now we're seeing Oregon Tempranillo. We're starting to see some Mencia. We're starting to see some real fun Syrah that's coming through as well. That's really acting well the soil. It may be a little time until we start to look at, maybe some wine finishes, but wine finish in a way that no one else is doing. And speaks to that provenance, exactly what he's saying. Speaks to the terroir. We have no need to go and get sherry.
Yeah.
We just don't. It's not who we are. Sherry is not for who we are. Pinot down the road, I mean, that's definitely a natural tap in. So
I think it's very exciting as well. We whether we're in Portland or we're in Sydney or Melbourne or Tasmania, our whiskies are inherently going to mature a little bit quicker than the rest of the world.
Right.
Certain barrels are getting more and more expensive.
Yeah.
What do we have a lot of? Wine barrels.
Wine barrels. Yeah.
I know for a fact Scotland are looking very hard at people like yourselves and Starward and the Indian Amaret and Paul John distilleries, because we will figure this out quicker than the rest of the world will.
Yes, you will.
Because it's going to take 400 years to do it in Scotland.
Yeah, and I think just to finish off, I would say that's the new. Just to add to that, the new world is teaching the old world some new tricks. The guys over at Brewdog, perfect example, making whiskey now. Craft really well known craft beer out of Scotland and the northern part of England. Just sort of seeing how they focus on fermentation back in that old world. And it's really interesting. I've had some of the earlier stuff. It's cool. Some of the new dog is teaching the old dog some new tricks. So it's this fun sort of thing to start to happen. Very small, but at the same time, fun to see that we can start to reciprocate back and forth.
Yeah. Well, mate, welcome home.
Thank you.
Very briefly. And
very briefly.
Go get your float before it gets too windy out there.
Cheers.
Thanks, mate.
Thanks, mate.